A controlling mother-in-law humiliates her son's wife, saying her taking over her mother's outdated bakery is beneath the family. When one of her socialite friends decide to order a wedding cake. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Now, let's get into it. Tracy grew up in a house that seemed to stretch and shrink to accommodate the rhythm of life. The modest two-bedroom bungalow, with its creaky wooden floors and slightly peeling paint, was never short on space for what mattered most: love, laughter, and the people who filled it. The dining table, though a tight squeeze for more than four, somehow always had room for neighbors who dropped by unannounced or for the occasional stray pet her younger brother insisted on adopting. To Tracy, the house wasn't just four walls, it was a living, breathing part of their family. Her father, Mr. Avery, was a schoolteacher with a patient smile and an endless supply of puns that were equally grown-worthy and endearing. He'd come home in the evenings, briefcase in one hand and a bag of apples in the other, claiming he was keeping the doctor away. He had a knack for making even the most mundane moments feel special, like how he turned setting the table into a game of napkin origami, or how he'd invent riddles to help Tracy memorize her times tables. Her mother, Mrs. Avery, was the heart of their home and the soul of their bakery. Every morning before dawn, she'd tie on her apron, fire up the ovens, and fill the air with the comforting scent of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls. The bakery, aptly named Avery's Treats, wasn't just a business, it was an extension of their home. Customers didn't just stop by for cookies, they stayed for the conversation, often swapping recipes or sharing neighborhood gossip while sipping on her mother's famous hot chocolate. And for Tracy, the bakery was a magical place where flour transformed into cakes and laughter into icing on top. Tracy's childhood was a patchwork quilt of moments that felt like pure joy. On weekends, her friends would pile into the small living room for slumber parties. The house would fill with the sound of giggles, the rustling of sleeping bags, and the unmistakable aroma of brownies fresh out of the oven. Her mother never failed to whip up their favorite treats, and her father would tell ghost stories so ridiculous they had the girls shrieking with laughter instead of fear. Even on quieter days, life was filled with simple joys. Tracy loved watching her parents work together. Her mother would experiment with a new recipe, her father acting as the eager taste tester, offering overly dramatic critiques that made everyone laugh. They weren't perfect, there were arguments about bills or the occasional burnt batch of cookies, but they always managed to find their way back to each other. Tracy often thought they were like two puzzle pieces, different shapes, but fitting together perfectly. It was a childhood that felt abundant, not because of material wealth, but because of the richness of connection. Tracy never realized how rare that was until much later, but at the time, it just felt normal. The messiness, the spontaneity, the closeness, it all seemed like the way life was meant to be. And in her heart, she quietly hoped that one day, she could create a life just as full of love and warmth as the one she had been lucky enough to grow up in. The sun streamed through the kitchen windows of the small bakery, dusting the room in a warm, golden glow. Tracy's mother hummed softly as she worked, her hands expertly kneading dough, while Tracy, no older than 6, perched on a stool beside her. Flour coated her little hands and nose as she eagerly imitated her mother's movements. It wasn't just a kitchen to Tracy, it was a place filled with laughter, love, and the sweet aroma of freshly baked bread. Growing up, this bakery was the heart of her family's life. It wasn't a grand building, but its warmth made up for its size. Her father, a school teacher, would stop by every afternoon, leaning over the counter to sneak a slice of pie. Friends and neighbors came not just for the treats but for the conversations, the laughter, and the feeling of being part of something. Tracy often joked that their home wasn't just a house, it was a revolving door for loved ones, friends, and pets. Every nook and cranny held memories of joy, and the walls seemed to hum with the echoes of shared stories. Life felt perfect to Tracy. The bakery taught her patience, creativity, and the value of hard work. She loved the way her mother seemed to pour her heart into every cake, every cookie. It wasn't just baking, it was love made tangible. One afternoon, as Tracy wiped her hands on her apron after delivering a box of cookies to a customer, she noticed a stranger lingering at the edge of the counter. He looked a bit lost, his dark hair slightly mussed, a bag slung over his shoulder. She stepped closer, flashing him a friendly smile. "Hi there. Can I help you with something?" she asked. He looked up, startled, and smiled back. "I, actually just got off the train and smelled something amazing. Thought I'd come in and see what it was." "Well, you're in the right place," Tracy said, motioning to the glass display case filled with pastries. "What's your favorite?" He hesitated. "To be honest, I don't know much about baked goods." Tracy laughed, her warmth putting him at ease. "Then you're about to be introduced to a whole new world." She handed him a small plate with a slice of her mom's famous apple pie. "Here, try this." The stranger took a bite, his eyes lighting up. "This is incredible." "Made with love," Tracy said with a wink. "I'm Tracy, by the way." "Josh," he replied. "And I think I've just found my new favorite spot." Over the next few weeks, Josh became a regular fixture at the bakery. He'd sit at the corner table, sometimes working on his laptop, other times simply chatting with Tracy. She learned he was in town for college, pursuing pre-med. He spoke about his family, a formal, high society household where love was expressed in structured ways, through obligations and traditions. It was so different from Tracy's life that she could hardly imagine it. But Josh didn't seem to miss that world, at least not when he was here. He loved the chaos of Tracy's bakery, the endless chatter of customers, the clinking of mugs, and the laughter that seemed to bubble up out of nowhere. And Tracy? She was fascinated by his ambition, his drive to make a difference. He had a calm determination about him that drew her in. One afternoon, as they sat outside on a bench, sharing a muffin, Josh looked over at her. "You know, I envy you." Tracy blinked. "Me? Why?" "This place, your family, it's so warm. So alive. My house is big, but it feels empty. Quiet." She thought about his words, about the contrast between their lives. "I guess it's just what you're used to," she said gently. "But I think it's kind of amazing that you want something different. It takes courage to go after what you really want." Josh gave her a look that lingered a little too long, his expression soft. "You have no idea how much I needed to hear that." From that moment, their connection deepened. They spent hours talking about everything, dreams, fears, the kind of lives they wanted to build. Tracy found herself looking forward to his visits, her heart fluttering every time she saw him walk through the door. And Josh? He couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way her smile seemed to light up the room. Their bond wasn't just about attraction, it was about understanding. They came from different worlds, but they shared a desire for something more, something real. Josh admired Tracy's authenticity, her refusal to be anyone but herself. And Tracy found inspiration in Josh's unwavering determination to follow his dreams. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Josh walked Tracy home after a long day at the bakery. They stopped outside her front door, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. "Tracy," Josh said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know we're from two different worlds, but I don't think I've ever felt this way about anyone before." Her cheeks flushed, but she met his gaze. "Me neither." He reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I don't know where this is going, but I want to find out. Together." Tracy smiled, her heart soaring. "I'd like that." As Josh walked away that night, Tracy leaned against the doorframe, watching him disappear into the distance. For the first time in her life, she felt like the world was opening up in ways she'd never imagined. And as much as she loved her family and her bakery, she couldn't help but wonder what her life might look like with Josh in it. It wasn't just a spark, it was the beginning of something extraordinary. Josh Reynolds grew up in a house that could have been mistaken for a museum. The sprawling estate sat atop a perfectly manicured hill, its white columns and sprawling verandas evoking an air of grandeur. Inside, everything seemed polished to perfection. Marble floors gleamed, antique furniture stood untouched, and paintings that could have belonged in a gallery adorned the walls. For Josh, this was just home, large, quiet, and meticulously maintained. His parents, Margaret and William Reynolds, were equally composed, their conversations often limited to discussions about investments, social events, and the family legacy. Dinner at the Reynolds home was an affair of formality. A long mahogany table stretched across the dining room, adorned with candelabras and crystal glasses. The family of 3 often sat scattered along its length, their voices barely louder than the clinking of silverware. Josh's father, a renowned surgeon, was a man of few words, his gaze more often on his watch than on his family. His mother, poised and graceful, had a way of turning every interaction into a lesson on decorum. Even as a boy, Josh knew there were unspoken rules to follow: speak when spoken to, sit up straight, and never bring chaos to the Reynolds household. But as Josh grew older, he started to feel the weight of his family's expectations. It wasn't enough to be intelligent or kind, he had to be exceptional. Every decision, from his clothes to his future career, was measured against what was deemed appropriate for someone bearing the Reynolds name. Josh had always wanted to help people, to do something meaningful with his life. Becoming a doctor felt like the perfect compromise, a noble profession that aligned with his family's prestige. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that something was missing. That sense of longing began to fade the moment he stepped into Tracy's world. Her family's bakery, with its worn wooden counters and mismatched chairs, felt like the exact opposite of everything he'd known. It was alive, filled with the scent of cinnamon and the sound of laughter. On his first visit, Tracy's mother greeted him with a flower-covered handshake, offering him a cookie before he'd even had a chance to sit down. Her father, warm and boisterous, pulled up a chair and immediately began telling a story about a disastrous science project from his teaching days. And then there was Tracy, her eyes sparkling as she leaned on the counter, clearly amused by his fish-out-of-water expression. For Josh, it was like stepping into a world he didn't know existed. He was captivated by the way her family spoke to each other, not with careful politeness, but with genuine affection. They teased, they laughed, they interrupted. It was messy in a way that felt exhilarating. Tracy's younger brother burst into the room at one point, carrying a puppy that promptly knocked over a basket of bread rolls. Instead of scolding, her mother laughed, scooping the puppy into her arms. Josh found himself smiling without realizing it. "What's funny?" Tracy asked, noticing the grin on his face. "Nothing," Josh replied, though it wasn't true. It was all funny, in the best possible way. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen a family so alive. The more time Josh spent with Tracy and her family, the more he realized how different their worlds were. In his house, there was a place for everything and everything stayed in its place. At the Averys, there were no rigid rules. Instead, there was an unspoken understanding that love and kindness were more important than appearances. For Josh, it was liberating, and a little overwhelming. Meanwhile, Tracy found herself growing increasingly curious about Josh's life. He rarely talked about his family, but when he did, there was a certain distance in his voice. She couldn't imagine growing up in a house where laughter wasn't a daily occurrence. One evening, as they walked home from the bakery, Tracy decided to ask. "Josh," she said, keeping her tone casual, "what's it like where you grew up?" He hesitated, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Different," he admitted. "It's quieter. My parents are great, don't get me wrong, but they're not exactly the warm and fuzzy type." Tracy tilted her head, curious. "So no slumber parties with endless trays of cookies?" Josh chuckled. "Not unless you count the catered galas my mom throws. But those are less about fun and more about, well, networking." Tracy tried to picture it, Josh in a tuxedo, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and whispered conversations. It was so far removed from her world that she almost laughed. "And you actually liked that?" "Not really," Josh admitted. "But it's what was expected. My mom's big on appearances. Everything has to look perfect, even if it's not." Tracy frowned, her heart aching for him. "That sounds lonely." Josh shrugged, his smile faint. "It can be. But that's why I love being here. With you. Your family, it feels like what a family should be." His words left Tracy speechless. She'd always taken her family's closeness for granted, never realizing how rare it was. In that moment, she felt an overwhelming urge to show Josh that life didn't have to be so rigid, that love didn't need to come with conditions. As their relationship deepened, Tracy found herself stepping into Josh's world for the first time. He took her to a dinner at his parents' house, a formal affair complete with place cards and a dress code. Tracy spent the entire evening on edge, terrified of saying or doing the wrong thing. Josh's mother, Margaret, was polite but distant, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. His father barely looked up from his plate. The contrast between this and the chaos of her own family dinners was staggering. Afterwards, as they drove back to her house, Tracy couldn't hold back her thoughts. "Josh, I don't think I belong in that world." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "You don't have to belong. I don't think I do, either." His words were comforting, but they didn't erase her doubts. As much as she cared for Josh, she couldn't ignore the differences between them. Still, she wasn't ready to give up. If there was one thing Tracy had learned from her parents, it was that love wasn't always easy, but it was always worth fighting for. And as she looked at Josh, she knew she was ready to fight. Through the chaos of college life, Tracy and Josh became each other's anchor. Between late-night study sessions and weekend coffee dates, they built a bond that felt unshakable. Josh poured himself into his pre-med program, while Tracy navigated her business courses with the same determination she used to perfect a batch of cupcakes. They cheered each other on during finals, celebrated small victories with ice cream runs, and even survived their first real argument over whether pineapple belonged on pizza. College was where they learned how to grow together, not just as a couple but as individuals. Tracy loved how Josh talked about his dream of becoming a doctor with so much passion, even when he was exhausted from long nights at the library. And Josh admired how Tracy's eyes lit up whenever she shared her ideas for opening her own bakery one day. They each had their own path, but somehow, they always managed to meet in the middle. By the time graduation rolled around, there was no doubt in their minds. They wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. When Josh proposed on a quiet evening in Tracy's backyard, under the glow of twinkling fairy lights, it felt like everything was falling into place. Tracy envisioned a small wedding in her parents' garden, surrounded by the people who mattered most. She could almost taste the lemon cake her mom would bake, and she laughed at the thought of her dad trying to officiate with one of his infamous puns. But Tracy's vision didn't align with Margaret Reynolds' expectations. To her, a wedding wasn't just a celebration of love, it was a statement. Margaret had grand plans, an opulent ceremony in a historic cathedral, a reception in a ballroom draped in crystal chandeliers, and a guest list that read more like a society magazine. It wasn't about Tracy or Josh, it was about appearances. Tracy tried to hold her ground, suggesting compromises that would allow for some of her ideas to shine through. But every suggestion was met with a polite yet firm dismissal. Margaret insisted that this was how things were done and assured Tracy she'd thank her later. Josh, caught between his mother's formidable presence and his fiancée's growing frustration, tried to mediate but found himself overwhelmed. By the time the wedding day arrived, Tracy barely recognized the event as her own. Her simple dress had been replaced with a designer gown chosen by Margaret. Her favorite sunflowers, which she'd dreamed of carrying down the aisle, were swapped for a bouquet of rare orchids that matched the color scheme. The guest list was filled with names she'd never heard of, and the carefully rehearsed ceremony felt more like a performance than a celebration of love. Tracy tried her best to smile as she walked down the aisle, her arm looped through her father's. But the grandeur of the cathedral felt suffocating. She glanced at Josh, standing at the altar in his tailored suit, and found some solace in his familiar eyes. Still, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't their day, it was Margaret's. The reception was no better. Tracy spent most of the evening shaking hands with strangers who praised her beauty and whispered about her humble beginnings. Her mother and father were relegated to a corner table, overshadowed by the more prominent guests. Even Josh seemed to disappear into the crowd, swept away by well-wishers and colleagues of his parents. As the night dragged on, Tracy found herself standing alone near the dessert table, staring at the towering wedding cake that Margaret had insisted on. It was stunning, of course, 7 tiers of intricate fondant designs, but it felt cold, impersonal. She couldn't help but think about the cake her mom had wanted to make, the one with imperfect buttercream swirls and a few sunflowers on top. That cake would have been hers. This one wasn't. Josh finally found her, his tie loosened and his expression weary. "Hey," he said softly, touching her arm. "You okay?" She forced a smile. "Yeah, just taking it all in." But Josh could see through her. "This isn't what you wanted, is it?" Tracy hesitated, then shook her head. "It's not about the flowers or the dress or the cake, Josh. I feel like I'm a guest at someone else's wedding." He pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her tightly. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I should have fought harder for you." Tears welled up in Tracy's eyes, but she blinked them away. She didn't want to cry, not here, not now. "It's done," she whispered. "We're married, and that's what matters." But as the reception continued, Tracy couldn't shake the hollow feeling in her chest. The day she'd dreamed about since she was a little girl had come and gone, and she felt like she'd missed it entirely. By the time they left for their honeymoon, she was already dreading what life in Josh's world would mean for her. Their honeymoon was a brief reprieve, a week spent in a cozy cabin in the mountains, away from the pressures of family and society. For those few days, it was just the two of them, laughing over board games and making plans for the future. Tracy clung to those moments, hoping they were a glimpse of what their life together could be. But when they returned, reality hit hard. Margaret had insisted they move into a wing of the Reynolds estate, citing practicality and tradition. Tracy found herself in a sprawling house that felt more like a gilded cage. There were staff to handle every task, from cooking to cleaning, leaving her with little to do but sit and wait for Josh to come home from the hospital. At first, Tracy tried to make the best of it. She decorated their space with a few personal touches, framed photos, cozy blankets, but it never felt like hers. She missed the chaos of her parents' house, the scent of bread baking in the morning, the sound of her dad's terrible jokes. And as much as she loved Josh, she couldn't ignore the growing loneliness that settled over her like a heavy fog. Josh was busy building his career, often working late into the night. Tracy didn't blame him, she was proud of his dedication, but it left her feeling even more isolated. She tried to connect with Margaret, hoping they could find common ground, but every conversation felt like a subtle critique of who she was and where she came from. One evening, as Tracy sat alone in the cavernous living room, her thoughts drifted back to her mother's bakery. She thought about the warmth of the ovens, the hum of customers chatting, and the satisfaction of creating something with her own hands. She missed that sense of purpose, of belonging. And for the first time, she began to wonder if she could ever truly find her place in Josh's world. Married life in the Reynolds estate was nothing like Tracy had imagined. The house, with its soaring ceilings and marble floors, was undeniably beautiful, but it felt more like a museum than a home. Margaret Reynolds had insisted it was the logical choice for a young couple building their life together. "It's sensible," she had said with her usual air of authority. "Why would you waste money renting or buying when there's an entire wing here waiting for you?" Josh, eager to keep the peace, had agreed, and Tracy, not wanting to cause a fight, went along with it. At first, she tried to see the positives. Their suite was stunning, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the gardens and a walk-in closet larger than her childhood bedroom. But no amount of luxury could fill the quiet that seemed to echo through the halls. She missed the hum of life, the clinking dishes in her parents' kitchen, her dad whistling off-key, even the sound of their dog's paws tapping on the floor. Here, everything was eerily still, the silence broken only by the occasional footsteps of the house staff. Tracy woke up each morning to a perfectly laid breakfast prepared by the cook. It was thoughtful, of course, but she found herself longing for the messy chaos of making pancakes with Josh, laughing as batter splattered on the counter. Now, her days seemed endless, her time swallowed by an emptiness she hadn't anticipated. With the staff handling everything from laundry to gardening, Tracy felt redundant, like a guest in her own life. She tried to occupy herself. She joined a book club at Margaret's suggestion, but the other members spent more time discussing fashion than the novels. She attended charity events with Margaret, who seemed determined to mold Tracy into the perfect society wife. At these gatherings, Tracy often felt like she was being displayed, a polished accessory for Josh's rising star. She smiled and nodded through conversations about investments and country club memberships, all the while feeling like an outsider looking in. Margaret's critiques, though subtle, began to chip away at her confidence. "That dress is lovely, dear, but perhaps next time something a little more tailored?" Or, "You did a wonderful job at the luncheon, Tracy. I was worried your background might make you uncomfortable in such a formal setting, but you managed well." Each comment was wrapped in politeness but stung nonetheless. Tracy found herself second-guessing everything, her clothes, her words, even the way she carried herself. Josh, meanwhile, was busier than ever. His career as a doctor was taking off, and Tracy couldn't have been prouder of him. But his long hours at the hospital meant he was rarely home, and when he was often too exhausted to do much more than eat dinner and fall asleep. Tracy understood, he was working hard to build their future, but she couldn't help feeling like they were growing apart. Their once lively conversations were reduced to quick exchanges about their day. The laughter that had always been the foundation of their relationship seemed to fade into the background. One evening, As Tracy sat alone in the vast living room, she stared at the flickering light of the fireplace and wondered how her life had come to this. She had everything she'd thought she wanted, a loving husband, a beautiful home, but it felt hollow. She missed the simplicity of her old life, the sense of purpose she'd felt working in her mother's bakery. More than anything, she missed the feeling of being truly herself. She decided to talk to Josh. When he came home that night, tired and distracted, she waited until he had finished his dinner before bringing it up. "Josh, can we talk?" He looked up from his plate, concerned. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "I don't know how to explain it," she began, choosing her words carefully. "I just feel lost. Like I don't have a place here." Josh set down his fork, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean? This is your home too." "It doesn't feel like it," Tracy admitted. "I know this setup makes sense for us right now, but I feel like I don't belong here. Like I'm just a piece of the puzzle that doesn't fit." Josh reached for her hand, his eyes softening. "I'm sorry, Tracy. I've been so focused on work that I haven't been there for you. I'll try to be better." She squeezed his hand, grateful for his reassurance, but deep down, she knew this wasn't just about Josh's absence. It was about her. She needed something more, something that was hers, something that made her feel whole again. The next day, she tried to throw herself into hobbies, hoping to fill the void. She started painting but quickly grew frustrated with her lack of skill. She volunteered at a local shelter but felt out of place among the other women, who all seemed to know each other. Everywhere she turned, she hit a wall, and the loneliness only grew heavier. One afternoon, Tracy found herself back in her parents' bakery. The familiar scent of vanilla and cinnamon greeted her like an old friend, and she felt a sense of relief she hadn't experienced in months. Her mother was at the counter, chatting with a regular customer, while her father worked on a crossword puzzle at a nearby table. Tracy smiled, feeling a pang of nostalgia. "Tracy," her mother exclaimed, beaming. "What a surprise. Come in, come in." Tracy stepped behind the counter, tying on an apron like she used to when she was a teenager. For the first time in a long while, she felt at ease. She spent the afternoon helping her mother bake, the rhythm of measuring, mixing, and kneading bringing her a sense of calm she hadn't realized she was missing. As the hours passed, an idea began to form in her mind. Maybe she didn't have to let go of this part of herself. Maybe there was a way to reclaim it. She didn't know how yet, but as she stood there, frosting a batch of cupcakes, she felt a spark of hope. When she returned to the Reynolds estate that evening, she carried with her a box of treats she had made. Margaret raised an eyebrow when Tracy offered her a cookie, but she took one nonetheless, nibbling at it delicately. Tracy couldn't tell if Margaret was impressed or simply being polite, but she didn't care. For the first time in months, she felt like she'd taken a step toward being herself again. As Tracy sat down that night to write in her journal, she made a promise to herself. She would find a way to bridge the gap between her old life and her new one. She didn't know what that would look like yet, but she was determined to try. She owed it to herself, and to Josh, to be true to who she was. Tracy stood in the middle of the bakery, her hands on her hips, and took a deep breath. The space was exactly as she remembered it, from the faint creak of the wooden floors to the sweet scent of vanilla that clung to every corner. But today, it felt different. It felt like a crossroads. Her mother had just finished explaining her plans to retire, her voice full of optimism as she spoke about finally having time to travel and join her book club. Tracy had listened intently, her mind swirling with memories and possibilities. As her mother busied herself boxing up cookies for a customer, Tracy glanced around the bakery. She could still see herself at 8 years old, standing on a stool to decorate cupcakes. She thought about the regulars who greeted her with warmth every time she walked through the door. And then she thought about the life she'd been living in the Reynolds estate, where she felt more like a visitor than a wife. The contrast was striking. After the customer left, Tracy turned to her mother. "What are you going to do with the bakery?" Her mother wiped her hands on her apron, her face thoughtful. "I'm not sure yet. I've thought about selling it, but it would be hard to see it go. It's been such a big part of our lives." Tracy felt a pang in her chest. The idea of someone else taking over the bakery felt wrong. What if I took over? Her mother's eyes lit up with surprise and joy. "Tracy, are you serious?" "I think I am," Tracy said, her voice growing more confident. "I've been feeling so disconnected. I miss working with my hands, creating something real. And I think I could really do something with this place, maybe expand, focus on wedding cakes. There's so much potential here." Her mother's face broke into a smile, and she pulled Tracy into a hug. "I can't think of anyone better to carry this on." That night, Tracy couldn't contain her excitement. As soon as Josh got home, she sat him down and told him her idea. She spoke quickly, her words tumbling out as she described her vision for the bakery. She painted a picture of delicate fondant flowers, decadent layers of cake, and a cozy storefront filled with brides-to-be tasting her creations. Josh listened, his expression unreadable. When she finally paused to take a breath, he said, "It sounds amazing, Tracy. But, have you thought about how this fits into our life?" Her heart sank a little. "What do you mean?" "I mean, taking over the bakery is a big commitment. And with everything we've got going on, my work, our obligations, it's a lot to add to the mix. Are you sure this is the right time?" Tracy frowned. She had hoped for more enthusiasm, but she tried to keep her tone calm. "Josh, I need something for myself. I've been feeling so lost lately, and this feels like the right move. It's not just about the bakery, it's about finding a purpose." Josh nodded, though he still looked uncertain. "I get that. I really do. I just want to make sure we're thinking this through. Especially with my mom, you know how she can be." Tracy bristled at the mention of Margaret. "What does your mom have to do with this?" "She has a certain idea of how things should look," Josh said carefully. "And I don't want her to make things harder for you." The next morning, Tracy sat across from Margaret in the sunroom, her nerves tingling as she explained her plans. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression as poised as ever. When Tracy finished, Margaret set down her teacup and folded her hands in her lap. "Well," Margaret began, her tone clipped, "I can see why you might feel sentimental about the bakery. But have you considered how this might reflect on Josh? On our family?" Tracy felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" Margaret's smile was polite, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's a sweet little place, of course. But it's hardly the kind of endeavor that aligns with our social circles. People might misunderstand. They might think it's quaint or even charming, but it's not exactly what one expects from the wife of a doctor." Tracy's hands clenched in her lap. "With all due respect, Margaret, I'm not doing this for appearances. I'm doing it because it's something I'm passionate about." Margaret's expression hardened. "Passion is fine, dear. But so is understanding your role. Josh is building an important career, and you have an opportunity to support him in that. Do you really want to distract from his accomplishments with baked goods?" Tracy's cheeks burned, but she held her ground. "I'm not distracting from anything. I'm building something of my own. Margaret's sigh was faint but pointed. I just hope you're prepared for the scrutiny that will come with it. That evening, Tracy recounted the conversation to Josh, her frustration bubbling over. She made it sound like I was embarrassing the family. Like baking cakes is some kind of disgrace. Josh rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncomfortable. She doesn't mean it like that, Tracy. She's just traditional. She wants what's best for us. And what about what's best for me? Tracy shot back. Why does everything have to revolve around what she thinks? Josh sighed. I'm on your side, Tracy. I just think we need to handle this carefully. She has a lot of influence, and if she's upset, it could make things harder for both of us. Tracy stared at him, her heart sinking. She had hoped Josh would be her biggest supporter, but now it felt like he was stuck in the middle, unwilling to take a stand. She swallowed her disappointment and nodded. I understand, she said quietly, though she wasn't sure she did. In the weeks that followed, Tracy threw herself into her plans for the bakery. She sketched designs for new displays, tested recipes late into the night, and met with vendors to discuss renovations. She felt alive for the first time in months, her creativity reignited by the work. But the tension at home lingered, unspoken but heavy. One afternoon, as she was frosting a cake, her mother stopped by the bakery. How's it coming along? She asked, her voice full of warmth. It's good, Tracy said, wiping her hands on her apron. But it's complicated. Her mother gave her a knowing look. Margaret? Tracy nodded. She thinks I'm making a mistake. That I'm embarrassing Josh. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder. Tracy, you've always followed your heart. Don't let anyone take that from you. This bakery was built on love and hard work, and I know you'll do amazing things with it. Tracy smiled, her resolve strengthening. She wasn't going to let anyone, Margaret, Josh, or her own doubts, stop her. This was her chance to rediscover who she was, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The bakery was bustling in a way Tracy hadn't seen in years. The smell of fresh pastries wafted through the air as customers filled the small space, their voices mixing with the cheerful chime of the door opening and closing. Tracy stood behind the counter, carefully piping intricate floral designs onto a towering wedding cake. Her apron was dusted with flour, and a streak of frosting painted her cheek, but she didn't care. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt alive. Word about her revamped bakery had started to spread. A local bride had posted photos of Tracy's custom cake on social media, and the buzz had been immediate. Orders began pouring in, not just for wedding cakes, but for birthday cupcakes, anniversary desserts, and even simple midweek treats. Tracy thrived in the chaos, her creativity pouring into every design. She loved the challenge of making each cake unique, and she felt a deep sense of pride every time a customer left with a smile. But not everyone was thrilled. Margaret had heard about the bakery's growing popularity through her social circle, and she was far from pleased. One afternoon, she appeared at the bakery unannounced, her designer coat pristine despite the drizzle outside. Tracy's heart sank the moment she saw her. Margaret, Tracy said, trying to keep her tone polite. What a surprise. Margaret's gaze swept over the room, taking in the flurry of activity. I heard this place was busy, she said, her voice laced with something that wasn't quite approval. I thought I'd see for myself. Tracy forced a smile. It's been a great start. People seem to like what we're doing. Margaret stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor. I can see that. But I can't help wondering, how do you think this reflects on Josh? Tracy's hands tightened around the piping bag she was holding. What do you mean? Margaret tilted her head, her expression carefully neutral. Josh is a doctor. A respected professional. And here you are, running a bakery. I just worry that people might see it as mismatched. Don't you think? Tracy felt a surge of anger, but she kept her voice steady. Margaret, this bakery isn't just a business to me. It's something I'm passionate about. And it's doing well. I don't see how that's a problem. Margaret gave a small, tight smile. Passion is all well and good, dear. But you have to think about the bigger picture. Appearances matter. Josh's career matters. Tracy clenched her jaw, struggling to keep her composure. And my career matters too. Margaret didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced at the wedding cake Tracy had been working on, her eyes scanning the delicate flowers with a critical air. I hope you're not overextending yourself. This sort of thing can be exhausting. I can handle it, Tracy said firmly, her chest tightening with frustration. Margaret didn't argue further, but her silence felt louder than words. She left the bakery soon after, but her disapproval lingered like a shadow. That evening, when Tracy returned home, she found Josh sitting at the dining table, flipping through patient charts. She set her bag down and joined him, her mind still swirling with thoughts from the day. How was your day? He asked without looking up. Busy, she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Your mom stopped by the bakery. Josh looked up, his brow furrowed. She did? Tracy nodded, crossing her arms. She thinks the bakery is embarrassing. That it's going to make you look bad. Josh sighed, setting his papers aside. I'm sure she didn't mean it like that. She absolutely meant it like that, Tracy shot back. Josh, she's been undermining me at every turn. And I feel like you're just letting it happen. Josh leaned back in his chair, his expression weary. Tracy, I'm not taking sides. I'm trying to keep the peace. Well, maybe it's time to stop keeping the peace, Tracy said, her frustration boiling over. I need you to stand up for me. Josh rubbed his temples, his exhaustion evident. It's not that simple. She's my mom. She's complicated. Complicated or not, she's making my life harder, Tracy said, her voice cracking slightly. I'm working my heart out to make this bakery a success, and instead of supporting me, she's tearing me down. Josh didn't reply right away, and the silence between them felt heavy. Finally, he said, I'll talk to her. Tracy nodded, though she didn't feel reassured. She wanted to believe Josh would stand up for her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still caught between them. The next few weeks were tense. Tracy threw herself even harder into her work, her days at the bakery long and demanding. The more success she had, the more determined Margaret seemed to push back. Tracy heard whispers from mutual acquaintances about Margaret's disapproval, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of it. Josh, meanwhile, seemed increasingly distant. His long hours at the hospital left him exhausted, and when he was home, he often seemed distracted. Tracy knew he was under pressure, but she couldn't help feeling like their relationship was slipping through her fingers. One evening, as Tracy worked late at the bakery, her phone buzzed with a text from Josh. Can you come home early tonight? We need to talk. Her stomach twisted as she read the message. She cleaned up quickly and headed home, her mind racing with possibilities. When she walked through the door, she found Josh sitting on the couch, his expression somber. He gestured for her to sit beside him, and she did, her heart pounding. What's going on? She asked, her voice tentative. Josh hesitated before speaking. Tracy, I've been thinking a lot about us. About everything that's been happening. She braced herself, unsure of where this was going. I want you to be happy, he continued. But I also want us to be okay. And right now, it feels like we're not. Tracy felt a lump rise in her throat. Josh, I'm trying. I'm trying so hard to make this work. I know you are, he said, his voice soft. And so am I. But this tension, between you and my mom, between your work and everything else, it's taking a toll. Tracy looked away, her eyes stinging. So what are you saying? Josh reached for her hand. I'm saying we need to figure out how to get back to us. To what we had before all of this. Tracy pulled her hand away, standing up. Before all of this? Josh, this is my life now. The bakery is part of who I am. I can't just go back. I'm not asking you to give it up, he said quickly. I just want to find a way to make it work, for both of us. Tracy's voice was steady, but her words were filled with pain. I've been trying to make it work, Josh. But I feel like I'm the only one fighting for it. Josh didn't reply, and the silence between them spoke volumes. Tracy turned and walked upstairs, her heart heavy with the weight of their unspoken fears. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. Tracy sat on the edge of the bed, her thoughts swirling like a storm. The argument with Josh earlier in the evening had left her feeling raw and exposed. It had started with something small, a comment about dinner plans, but quickly escalated into an explosion of frustration and hurt that had been building for weeks. They had said things that couldn't be unsaid, each defending their corner of a life that seemed to be pulling them further apart. You don't get it, Josh, she had said, her voice trembling with both anger and sadness. I can't keep living like this, living your mother's version of what our life is supposed to be. Josh had looked at her, his exhaustion blending into exasperation. And I can't keep dealing with you making everything about a fight. She's trying to help, Tracy. Tracy had laughed bitterly at that, the sound harsh even to her own ears. Help? By making me feel small at every turn? By undermining my work, my dreams, my very existence in this family? That's not help, Josh. That's control. I'm stuck in the middle here. Josh had shot back, his voice rising. I'm trying to make everyone happy, but nothing seems to be enough for you. The words had landed like a punch to the stomach. Tracy had taken a deep breath, steadying herself, before delivering the truth she had been holding back. Maybe that's the problem, Josh. Maybe we're too busy trying to live someone else's idea of what our life should be. But I'm done. I'm not giving up my work, and I'm not going to keep living like this, stuck in your mother's house, playing a role that isn't mine. Now, sitting in the silence of their bedroom, Tracy felt the weight of her words pressing down on her. She wasn't sure if she and Josh could find their way back to the easy connection they once had. It felt like they were speaking different languages, their shared dreams buried under the layers of expectations and resentment. The next morning, Tracy arrived at the bakery earlier than usual. The comfort of the familiar routine helped soothe her frayed nerves. She had barely started mixing the batter for the day's first batch of cupcakes when her assistant, Maya, rushed in holding a slip of paper. Tracy, you're not going to believe this, Maya said, her excitement bubbling over. We just got a call from Mrs. Harper. She wants you to design her daughter's wedding cake. Tracy blinked, trying to process the information. Mrs. Harper was one of Margaret's friends, a regular at the charity galas and garden parties that Margaret so often insisted Tracy attend. Are you sure it's the same Mrs. Harper? Tracy asked cautiously. Positive, Maya said, grinning. She said she's heard about your cakes and thinks you'd be perfect for the job. Tracy felt a mix of excitement and hesitation. The Harpers were high profile, and this wedding was bound to be a grand affair. It was the kind of opportunity that could elevate her bakery's reputation to an entirely new level. But she couldn't ignore the connection to Margaret. Was this truly about her talent, or was Mrs. Harper trying to do her mother-in-law a favor? Still, as the details of the order began to take shape, Tracy found herself swept up in the challenge. The bride, Emily, wanted something romantic yet modern, delicate sugar flowers cascading down tiers of smooth fondant, with flavors that felt both classic and innovative. Tracy threw herself into the work, experimenting with new techniques and testing flavors late into the night. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of joy that hadn't been dulled by the tensions at home. When the day of the wedding arrived, Tracy delivered the cake to the venue herself, wanting to ensure every detail was perfect. The ballroom was a vision of elegance, with soft candlelight and towering floral arrangements. The cake stood proudly in the center, a testament to Tracy's hard work and artistry. She watched from the sidelines as the guests admired it, their murmurs of appreciation filling her with a quiet pride. But the true surprise came later that evening, when Emily posted a photo of the cake on her social media. The image, captioned with glowing praise for Tracy's work, quickly went viral. Within hours, Tracy's inbox was flooded with inquiries from brides, event planners, and even a few local celebrities. Her bakery's social media following skyrocketed, and the buzz was undeniable. Back at home, Tracy sat on the couch, scrolling through the comments on her phone. She felt a sense of validation that she hadn't realized she needed. For so long, she had been fighting to prove her worth, not just to Margaret, but to herself. And now, her work was speaking for itself. Josh walked into the room, his expression guarded. He had seen the posts too, and while he was happy for her success, he couldn't hide the conflict in his eyes. "Congratulations," he said, sitting down beside her. The cake looked incredible. "Thank you," Tracy said softly, unsure of what else to say. Josh hesitated before continuing. "I know things have been hard between us. And I know I haven't always been as supportive as I should have been." Tracy looked at him, her emotions swirling. "Josh, I love you. But I need you to understand that this bakery, it's not just a hobby. It's who I am. And I can't keep apologizing for that." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I don't want you to apologize for it. I guess I've been afraid. Afraid that we're growing into two different people." Tracy reached for his hand, her voice steady. "We are growing, Josh. But that doesn't mean we have to grow apart. We just have to learn how to support each other in the lives we're building." Josh squeezed her hand, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I want to do better. For you. For us." The weeks following the viral wedding cake felt like a whirlwind for Tracy. Orders flooded in from across the state, each one more elaborate than the last. Reporters from local news outlets visited the bakery, eager to interview the woman behind the viral sensation. Her inbox brimmed with inquiries, and she even received a call from a national bridal magazine wanting to feature her as an up-and-coming wedding cake designer. It was overwhelming but exhilarating. The bakery, once a quiet, tucked-away gem, now buzzed with activity. Tracy expanded her team, bringing in talented assistants to help meet the growing demand. She worked long hours, but it didn't feel like work, it felt like purpose. Every cake she created was an expression of her creativity, and each happy client reminded her why she'd fought so hard to keep this dream alive. Josh began to notice the change in her. At first, He'd viewed her success with a mix of pride and apprehension, worried about how it might further strain their already tenuous relationship. But as he watched her pour her heart into her work, he began to see it differently. He saw the light in her eyes when she talked about a new design, the joy in her voice when she shared stories of grateful clients. Slowly, he started to understand that the bakery wasn't just a business to Tracy, it was a part of her soul. One evening, as Tracy sat at the dining table sketching ideas for an upcoming cake, Josh joined her. He watched her work for a moment before speaking. "You're really amazing at this, you know." Tracy looked up, surprised by his tone. "Thank you," she said softly, setting her pencil down. "That means a lot." Josh hesitated before continuing. "I think I've been unfair. I didn't fully appreciate how much this means to you. I see it now, though. I see how much love you put into everything you do." Her heart swelled at his words, but there was still a flicker of doubt. "Josh, I need to know that you're with me on this. Not just for the good moments, but for all of it." "I am," he said firmly, reaching for her hand. "And I'm sorry it took me this long to get here." For the first time in months, Tracy felt like they were on the same page. They talked late into the night, sharing their hopes and fears, and by the time they went to bed, Tracy felt a glimmer of hope that their marriage could not only survive but thrive. But Margaret wasn't ready to let things go so easily. Word of Tracy's growing success had reached her, and while she couldn't deny the bakery's popularity, she still saw it as a threat. Margaret had spent years crafting an image for her family, an image of elegance and prestige, and she viewed Tracy's newfound fame as a disruption to that carefully curated narrative. During a charity luncheon, Margaret overheard several guests gushing about Tracy's cakes. While their praise was genuine, Margaret interpreted it as an affront. It didn't matter that Tracy's work was bringing positive attention to the family. In Margaret's eyes, it was a distraction from Josh's accomplishments. She decided it was time to intervene. Later that week, Margaret invited Tracy to tea under the guise of mending fences. Tracy was wary but agreed, hoping to find common ground. She arrived at the Reynolds estate and was greeted by Margaret's usual polished demeanor. They sat in the sunroom, delicate china teacups between them, and Tracy braced herself for whatever was coming. "I must say," Margaret began, her tone measured, "you've certainly made quite a name for yourself." "Thank you," Tracy replied cautiously. "It's been a lot of hard work, but I'm proud of what I've accomplished." Margaret nodded, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Hard work is admirable, of course. But I can't help wondering, have you thought about how this might affect Josh's career?" Tracy stiffened. "I don't see how my success has anything to do with Josh's career." Margaret tilted her head, her expression feigning concern. "People talk, dear. And sometimes, they misunderstand. They might think Josh isn't the focus of the family anymore. That can be problematic." Tracy set her cup down, her patience wearing thin. "With all due respect, Margaret, I think Josh and I can decide for ourselves what's best for our family." Margaret's facade slipped, and her tone turned sharper. "You may think that, but let me remind you, appearances matter. Josh has a reputation to uphold, and this bakery of yours could overshadow that." Tracy's frustration boiled over. "This bakery isn't a hobby, Margaret. It's my career. And it's not overshadowing Josh, it's complementing him. We're building our lives together, not competing." Margaret leaned forward, her voice icy. "If you truly cared about this family, you'd consider stepping back." Tracy stood, her hands trembling with anger. "I care about this family, Margaret. That's why I won't let you bully me into giving up what I love. I've worked too hard to let anyone take this away from me." Without waiting for a response, Tracy walked out of the sunroom, her heart pounding. She knew she'd just declared war, but she also knew she couldn't live her life under Margaret's thumb any longer. When she told Josh about the confrontation, he listened intently, his jaw tightening as she recounted Margaret's words. "I'm sorry she said those things to you," he said finally. "She had no right. I know she's your mom, Josh, but I can't keep letting her control our lives," Tracy said, her voice firm. "This has to stop." "It will," Josh promised. "I'll talk to her." True to his word, Josh confronted Margaret the next day. Their conversation was tense, but he made it clear that he supported Tracy and wouldn't tolerate any more interference. Margaret, though visibly displeased, seemed to realize she had pushed too far. With Margaret temporarily subdued, Tracy allowed herself to focus on the bakery and her growing success. The bridal magazine feature was published, showcasing her work in stunning detail, and the response was overwhelming. Tracy's inbox filled with messages from aspiring bakers, thanking her for inspiring them to follow their own dreams. For the first time in a long time, Tracy felt a sense of balance returning to her life. And for the first time in their marriage, Josh seemed to truly understand her. He became her biggest cheerleader, celebrating her victories and supporting her through the challenges. They weren't perfect, there were still arguments and moments of doubt, but they were learning how to navigate their differences with compassion and respect. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the bakery, illuminating the rows of pastries and the towering cakes that had become Tracy's signature. She moved with ease between her workbench and the counter, a faint smile on her face as she listened to the chatter of customers. The past few months had been a whirlwind, but today felt different. Lighter. She had finally found her rhythm, both in her work and in her life. Josh walked into the bakery mid-morning, his white coat slung over his arm and a determined expression on his face. Tracy glanced up from piping roses onto a cake, surprised to see him. He rarely stopped by during the day. "Josh," she said, setting down her piping bag. "What are you doing here?" He smiled faintly, looking around the bustling space. "I needed to see you. Can we talk?" Tracy wiped her hands on her apron and nodded, leading him to a quieter corner near the back. "What's going on?" He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I had a long talk with my mom yesterday." Tracy's heart quickened. And I told her everything," he said firmly. "That I support you, that I believe in what you're doing, and that I won't let her interfere anymore. I told her she needs to respect you, respect us, or she'll lose both of us." Tracy stared at him, her chest tightening with emotion. "Josh. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said, reaching for her hand. "I should have done this a long time ago. I'm sorry it took me so long to realize what you needed from me. You've always been there for me, and I should have been there for you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, nodding. "Thank you. That means everything to me." Later that evening, they sat together on the couch, a bottle of wine between them as they talked about their future. For the first time in months, they weren't arguing or avoiding hard topics. They were honest, vulnerable, and hopeful. "I know things haven't been easy," Tracy said softly. "But I think we've come out stronger for it." Josh nodded. "We have. And I'm ready to make us my priority. Whatever it takes." Their conversation turned to dreams, expanding the bakery, finding a home of their own, maybe even starting a family. Tracy felt a renewed sense of connection to the man she had fallen in love with, and she knew they were finally on the same page. As Tracy's bakery continued to flourish, she began mentoring aspiring bakers, hosting workshops, and sharing the skills she had honed over the years. Her flagship store became a destination for cake enthusiasts, and her story of resilience and creativity inspired countless others. She even received an offer to write a book about her journey, which she eagerly accepted. To Tracy's surprise, Margaret began to soften. One afternoon, Margaret stopped by the bakery unannounced, carrying a box of pastries Tracy had delivered to a charity event. "These were incredible," Margaret said, her tone genuine. Everyone couldn't stop talking about them. Tracy raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to say. Margaret hesitated, then added, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong to judge you. What you've built here, it's remarkable. And I can see how much it means to Josh. And to you." Tracy felt a flicker of relief. "Thank you, Margaret. That means a lot." They weren't suddenly best friends, but it was a start. Over time, their interactions became less strained, and Margaret began to genuinely support Tracy's work. Tracy could see the effort, and she appreciated it. On their first anniversary, Josh surprised Tracy with dinner at a cozy restaurant in town. They reminisced about their journey, both the struggles and the triumphs, and toasted to the life they were building together. But the real surprise came later that evening when Josh drove her to a quiet neighborhood and parked in front of a charming two-story house. "What's this?" Tracy asked, stepping out of the car. Josh grinned, pulling her hand as they walked up the driveway. "I saw this place the other day and thought it might be worth a look. Come on." They stepped inside, and Tracy immediately fell in love with the warm, open layout and the large kitchen that was perfect for baking. They wandered through the house, and when they reached the second floor, Josh led her to a room with soft yellow walls. "It has a spare bedroom," he said, his voice soft. "It could make a great nursery. Someday." Tracy turned to him, her breath catching. "Josh. Are you serious?" He nodded, his eyes full of love. "I want this with you. All of it." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she hugged him tightly, her heart bursting with happiness. It wasn't just a house, it was a new beginning. A place where they could build their future, filled with love, laughter, and maybe even the pitter-patter of little feet. For the first time in a long time, Tracy felt truly at peace. They had faced their challenges, and while there would undoubtedly be more ahead, she knew they could handle them together. As they stood in that empty house, dreaming about the life they would fill it with, Tracy couldn't help but feel that they were exactly where they were meant to be.